Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses." Those words, spat with the venom of a man who believed he was God, would echo in the mind of Officer Jonathan Calloway for the rest of his miserable life. They were the beginning of his end. Judge Evelyn Reed, dressed in a simple but elegant pantsuit, approached the marble steps of the very courthouse that bore her name on a bronze plaque inside. She was 58, a woman who had fought her way from the projects to the pinnacle of the legal world, and she carried a briefcase filled with the lives and futures she would weigh in the balance today. The morning air was crisp, but a chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the predatory gaze of Officer Calloway. "Another ghetto rat trying to sneak in." The words were a low growl, meant for her and her alone. Calloway, a man built like a brick wall with a face that looked like it had lost a fight with a bag of rocks, blocked her path. His eyes, small and dark, raked over her with a pure, unadulterated contempt that he had practiced and perfected over a 15-year career of terrorizing the powerless. Evelyn stopped. She looked at his name tag, Calloway, then met his gaze. "I have business in this courthouse, officer." "Your business is probably with a bail bondsman," he sneered. "Let me see some ID." She began to set her briefcase down to retrieve her wallet, but she wasn't fast enough for the rage simmering just beneath his skin. "I don't have all day! Move it!" Before she could react, his open palm cracked against her face. The sound was like a gunshot, sharp and final, echoing off the stone facade of the Hall of Justice. Her head snapped sideways with such force that for a moment the world was a blur of spinning concrete and sky. The expensive leather briefcase, a gift from her late husband, flew from her grip. Legal documents, judicial memoranda, and the intimate details of a dozen lives scattered like macabre confetti across the courthouse steps. Pain exploded in her jaw, hot and blinding, but before she could even register it, Calloway grabbed her by the throat. His fingers, thick and calloused, dug into her skin, cutting off her air. He slammed her back against a massive stone pillar, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. Her head bounced off the unforgiving rock, and stars burst behind her eyes. "Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses," he hissed, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and foul with the smell of stale coffee and self-righteousness. He twisted her arms behind her back with a brutal efficiency that spoke of long practice. Cold, unforgiving metal bit into her wrists as the handcuffs clicked shut. Other officers, his loyal pack, began to gather. Miller and Diaz. They weren't intervening, they were spectating, laughing, recording with their phones, preserving the humiliation for later enjoyment. Evelyn's jaw throbbed, a deep, sickening ache that was quickly being overshadowed by a cold, crystalline rage. Her eyes, however, stayed locked on the grand bronze nameplate above the courthouse entrance, 20 feet from where she was being brutalized by the very system she had sworn to uphold. The Honorable Judge E. Reed, presiding. Have you ever seen instant karma this savage? Have you ever witnessed a man dig his own grave with such spectacular arrogance? Stick with me, because the shovel was just getting warmed up. Inside the temporary holding courtroom, a place usually reserved for minor arraignments, Calloway straightened his uniform and cleared his throat. He smoothed the non-existent wrinkles from his perfectly pressed shirt. He had done this dance 100 times before. Spin the story, control the narrative, make himself the hero. The system, his system, always believed cops over criminals, especially when those criminals looked like Evelyn Reed. "Your Honor," Calloway began, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone of authority. He was addressing Judge Peterson, a pale, thin man in his late 60s who was filling in for the morning docket and looked more like a nervous librarian than a jurist. I was conducting routine security protocols at the main entrance when I encountered a suspicious individual attempting to breach courthouse security. He gestured with a dismissive flick of his hand toward Evelyn, who now sat in handcuffs at the defendant's table. A grotesque, purple bruise was already blooming across her left cheek, a testament to his routine security protocol. The defendant, he continued, was acting erratically, dressed inappropriately for court proceedings, and refused to provide identification. She became increasingly agitated when asked to comply with standard security procedures. Judge Peterson, clearly out of his depth, nodded along, his face a mask of credulous approval. "And what exactly did you observe, Officer Calloway?" "Well, sir," Calloway's eyes gleamed as he warmed to his fabrication, adding layers to the lie with the skill of a master weaver. "She was carrying what appeared to be stolen legal documents, official letterhead, case files, the kind of things a civilian should never have access to." From the gallery, his two cronies, Officers Miller and Diaz, exchanged knowing smirks. They had heard Calloway tell variations of this story dozens of times. Different faces, same script. It always worked. When I approached to investigate, Calloway's voice dripped with disdain. "She became verbally aggressive, using profanity and making threats against me and my family." A masterful touch, adding the threats to family detail. It always played well. "She kept screaming about being someone important," he said, making air quotes with his fingers. "These people always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability. I've seen this playbook before, Your Honor. It's a classic deflection tactic." Judge Peterson leaned forward, his brow furrowed with concern. "Did she attempt to flee or resist arrest in any way?" "Absolutely," Calloway said without a flicker of hesitation. "The defendant became physically combative when I attempted to place her in protective custody for her own safety and the safety of the courthouse. I was forced to use the minimum necessary force to ensure public safety." His hand trembled, almost imperceptibly, as he spoke. It wasn't a tremor of fear or guilt. It was the thrill, the adrenaline rush of absolute power. The courthouse stenographer's fingers flew across her machine, capturing every lie, every syllable of his career's suicide note, for posterity. In the back row, a young law clerk frowned, a nagging feeling of familiarity pricking at the edge of her memory. Something about the defendant's posture, her calm, controlled fury. "Officer Miller," the prosecutor, Diane Jennings, called out. She was a middle-aged woman with a tired face and a reputation for always backing the police. "Can you corroborate Officer Calloway's testimony?" Miller stood, his uniform pressed to perfection, his face a mask of solemn duty. "Yes, ma'am. I witnessed the entire incident. The defendant was clearly attempting to circumvent security protocols. She was belligerent and non-compliant. Officer Calloway handled the situation with remarkable professionalism and restraint." "And the alleged assault?" Judge Peterson inquired, looking at the swelling bruise on Evelyn's face. Calloway's jaw tightened. "Your Honor, as I stated, I used only the force necessary to subdue an aggressive, potentially dangerous individual who was threatening courthouse security. The defendant's injuries, if any, are a direct result of her own violent resistance to lawful commands." He pulled out his phone, swiping to a video that conveniently started mid-confrontation, after he had already struck her and had her pinned against the wall. "I have partial footage here, though unfortunately my body cam malfunctioned this morning. A battery issue." The lie rolled off his tongue like honey. So smooth, so practiced. "How convenient," Evelyn murmured, speaking for the first time. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a razor. "I'm sorry?" Judge Peterson raised an eyebrow, startled. "Nothing, Your Honor," she replied calmly, her eyes blazing with a fire that could have melted steel. Calloway pressed his advantage, his confidence swelling. What we're seeing here is a classic case of someone playing the victim card after being caught breaking the law. She was trespassing on government property, carrying suspicious documents, and when confronted with her criminal behavior, she immediately claimed discrimination. It's a calculated manipulation of public sympathy. The prosecutor, Diane Jennings, nodded sympathetically. Officer Calloway, in your 15 years of decorated service, have you encountered similar situations? Unfortunately, yes. All the time. There's a pattern here, Calloway said, his voice rising with righteous indignation. Certain individuals believe they're above the law, that the rules don't apply to them. They use baseless accusations of racism to deflect from their own criminal behavior. It's honestly insulting to the real victims of discrimination. Several people in the gallery, mostly white courthouse employees who saw Calloway as a protector, nodded in agreement. They had heard similar stories on the news, seen similar narratives play out on social media. It felt familiar. It felt right. Officer Diaz, the third member of the pack, stepped forward. If I may add, Your Honor, the defendant was carrying what appeared to be confidential legal documents. We suspect she may have been involved in some kind of identity theft or fraud scheme. Judge Peterson looked intrigued. A fraud scheme? Yes, sir. Calloway jumped back in, sensing the final nail was ready for the coffin. These documents had judicial letterhead, sensitive case numbers, witness information. No legitimate citizen would have access to materials like this. We believe she may have been planning to impersonate court personnel to gain access to restricted areas. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating, but Calloway, blinded by his own arrogance, was oblivious to the trap he was setting for himself. In my professional opinion, he concluded, turning to face Evelyn directly, his eyes cold and contemptuous, this is simply another case of someone trying to game the system. She knows if she can make this about race, about alleged police brutality, she can distract from her actual crimes. These people think they can just waltz into any building, any courtroom, any space they choose, and when they're stopped, they scream discrimination. Well, not in my courthouse, not on my watch. The words hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Your Honor, Prosecutor Jennings added, the state recommends we proceed with charges of trespassing, resisting arrest, assault on a police officer, and suspicion of felony fraud. The defendant's attempt to frame this as a civil rights issue is clearly a desperate and, frankly, pathetic defense strategy. Calloway allowed himself a small, tight smile. This was going exactly as planned. Another case closed. Another win. Another reminder that the system worked just the way it was supposed to. People knew their place, or they learned it the hard way. Furthermore, he added, emboldened by the supportive atmosphere, I want to emphasize that I showed remarkable restraint. The defendant was clearly unstable, possibly under the influence of narcotics. A lesser officer might have used much more significant force, a taser, perhaps even their service weapon, given her level of aggression. Judge Peterson nodded gravely. Your professionalism is noted, Officer Calloway. In the defendant's chair, Evelyn sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap despite the cold steel of the handcuffs. Her expression remained calm, almost serene, but anyone looking closely would have noticed the slight upturn at the corners of her mouth. It wasn't a smile. It was the look of a predator patiently watching its prey walk deeper and deeper into a perfectly laid trap. She was taking meticulous mental notes of every lie, every fabrication, every detail that would soon unravel not just Calloway's career, but his entire life. The officer had no idea he was delivering his own eulogy in front of the one person who had the power to sign his death warrant. Is there anything else you'd like to add, officer? Judge Peterson asked. Calloway straightened his shoulders, puffing out his chest. Just that incidents like this remind us why we need strong law enforcement. Some people only understand authority when it's backed by force. The defendant learned today that actions have consequences. He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. The prosecutor smiled confidently. The state rests its case against this defendant, Your Honor. The evidence clearly shows a pattern of criminal behavior and a dangerous resistance to lawful authority. As Calloway stepped down from the witness stand, he caught Evelyn's eye one final time. He winked at her. A gesture of complete dominance. Total victory. It would be the last moment of triumph in his entire life. The defendant may now present her statement, Judge Peterson announced, his tone suggesting this would be a mere formality before sentencing. Evelyn Reed rose slowly from her chair, the handcuffs clinking softly in the silent courtroom. Despite the angry purple bruise on her cheek and the disheveled state of her clothes, she carried herself with an unmistakable dignity, a quiet power that made several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Thank you, Your Honor." Her voice was clear, controlled, and carried an authority that seemed to fill the entire room, an authority that felt ancient and absolute. "I appreciate the opportunity to address these creative allegations." Judge Peterson blinked. Something in her tone, her vocabulary, was jarringly unexpected. It didn't match the narrative of the unhinged ghetto rat he had just been presented with. "First," she began, her eyes sweeping the courtroom methodically, landing on Calloway, then Miller, then Diaz, then Jennings. "I want to clarify several factual inaccuracies in Officer Calloway's testimony. According to his statement, I was trespassing on government property. However, I was walking on a public sidewalk approaching the main entrance of this courthouse at approximately 8:47 a.m. She turned slightly, addressing Judge Peterson directly. "Your Honor, I'm sure you're familiar with the Supreme Court ruling in Hague v. Committee for Industrial Organization, which clearly establishes that public sidewalks adjacent to government buildings are traditional public forums, where all citizens have a constitutional right to be present." The stenographer's fingers paused mid-stroke. The prosecutor frowned. This wasn't the rambling, emotional outburst they'd expected from a cornered suspect. "Furthermore," Evelyn continued, her voice as sharp and precise as a scalpel, "Officer Calloway testified that I was carrying suspicious documents and suggested I was involved in identity theft. I'd like to examine that claim more closely." She gestured with her cuffed hands toward the evidence table, where her scattered papers had been collected into a messy pile. "Those documents are indeed authentic legal materials. Specifically, they include pending case files for the State v. Peterson, judicial memoranda regarding county budget allocations, and administrative correspondence with the governor's office, all of which I have legitimate, and I might add, exclusive, access to in my professional capacity." "Professional capacity?" Judge Peterson interrupted, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "And what exactly is your profession, Miss—" Evelyn paused, a slight, dangerous smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "It's Judge Reed, and I think we'll get to my professional background shortly, Your Honor." A chill, cold and sharp, ran down Calloway's spine. Something was very, very wrong with this picture. This wasn't supposed to happen. "Your Honor, if I may continue," she said, her voice taking on the familiar cadence of someone completely in command in a courtroom setting. "Officer Calloway also testified under oath that I became verbally aggressive and used profanity. I'd like to address that claim by invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent regarding any statements I may have made during the unprovoked assault." However, she paused, letting the legal implications sink in. "I will note for the record that any statements I did make were in direct response to being physically assaulted without provocation, without warning, and without a shred of legal justification." The young law clerk in the back row sat bolt upright. The voice, the command, the legal precision. She knew that voice. Now, regarding the officer's claim that his body cam malfunctioned, Evelyn continued, and now there was steel in her voice. Your Honor, I'm sure you're aware of the federal rules of evidence, particularly Rule 106, the rule of completeness. I have reason to believe that comprehensive, unedited video and audio evidence of this morning's entire incident exists and will be made available to this court. Judge Peterson leaned forward, his confusion turning to alarm. What kind of evidence are you referring to? Your Honor, this courthouse has an extensive security camera network, including 6 high-definition cameras positioned at 15-foot intervals along the main approach. Those cameras record in 4K and upload to a secure, off-site server in real time. Additionally, the county maintains an automatic, encrypted backup system for all officer body cam footage, regardless of any claimed equipment malfunctions on the device itself, a fact that a 15-year veteran like Officer Calloway should be well aware of. The color drained from Calloway's face. He had completely forgotten about the courthouse security cameras in his rush to fabricate his heroic narrative. I would like to formally request, Evelyn continued, her voice ringing with authority, that this court issue a preservation order for all electronic surveillance data from this morning between 8:45 a.m. and 9:15 a.m., including but not limited to all courthouse security footage, all officer body cam backup files from Officers Calloway, Miller, and Diaz, and any and all mobile phone recordings that may have been made by officers present at the scene. Prosecutor Jennings stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant cannot simply make wild evidentiary demands without proper legal representation. Evelyn turned to face the prosecutor with a look so cold and withering that the woman took an involuntary step backward. Your Honor, pro se defendants have the constitutional right to present evidence in their own defense under the Sixth Amendment. Additionally, Brady v. Maryland establishes the prosecution's absolute obligation to preserve and turn over all potentially exculpatory evidence. Are you suggesting this court ignore both the Sixth Amendment and Supreme Court precedent, Ms. Jennings? The silence in the courtroom was deafening. This was not how these cases were supposed to go. Judge Peterson cleared his throat, his face now beaded with sweat. Miss Williams, you seem unusually familiar with legal procedure. Do you have formal legal training? I have some experience with the judicial system, Your Honor. Evelyn's response was carefully neutral, but her eyes gleamed with something that looked almost like amusement. She walked, as much as the handcuffs would allow, to the evidence table and gestured toward her scattered belongings. Your Honor, I'd also like to address Officer Calloway's characterization of my presence here as suspicious or unauthorized. She pointed to a specific document among the papers. This is my daily court calendar. It shows I was scheduled to preside over... It shows I was scheduled to appear in this very building for legitimate business, starting at 9 a.m. this morning. The bailiff, a large, stoic man named Henderson, who had worked in this courthouse for 20 years, suddenly went very still. He was staring at Evelyn, at the way she held herself, the way she spoke, and a horrifying recognition began to dawn on his face. Officer Calloway testified that I claimed to be someone important, Evelyn continued. I'd like to clarify that I never made any such claim during our encounter. However, I did attempt to show him my identification, which he refused to examine before initiating his assault. She paused, surveying the courtroom, letting the full weight of her words settle. Your Honor, I have in my possession, despite Officer Calloway's violent interference, documentation that will conclusively establish both my identity and my legitimate reason for being at this courthouse this morning. Judge Peterson was beginning to look physically ill. What kind of documentation? Evelyn reached carefully into her jacket pocket, moving slowly to avoid startling anyone. From it, she produced 3 items. My judicial parking pass, issued by this courthouse's administrative office. My building access card, programmed with my judicial chamber's unique entry code. And my official identification. The bailiff, Henderson, suddenly stood up, his face as pale as a ghost as he recognized the woman he had greeted with a respectful, "Good morning, Your Honor." Every single day for the past 12 years. "Your Honor," Evelyn said quietly, her voice resonating with the power she had held back until this very moment. "I believe there has been a significant and catastrophic misunderstanding about who exactly Officer Calloway assaulted this morning." She held up a leather credential wallet. And even from across the room, the gleaming gold judicial seal of the United States Federal Court was clearly, terrifyingly visible. "Perhaps," she suggested, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who was used to giving orders in courtrooms, not taking them, "we should recess so that proper identifications can be verified." Judge Peterson stared at the credential wallet, then at Evelyn's bruised but resolute face, then at the bailiff, who was nodding grimly, his expression one of pure horror. Court will recess for 15 minutes, he said hoarsely. As the gavel fell, Jonathan Calloway felt his world, his career, and his life begin to crumble into dust around him. Whatever sick, twisted game he thought he was playing, he was just now beginning to realize that he didn't even understand the rules. Do you feel that? That's the feeling of karma loading a shotgun. We're only halfway through this, and the real fireworks are about to begin. If you think this is insane, drop a comment below and tell me what you think should happen to this officer. And don't forget to like this video to help us fight the algorithm. During the 15-minute recess, the courthouse buzzed with a nervous, frantic energy. Whispers turned to frantic phone calls. The system was short-circuiting. In a small holding room adjacent to the courtroom, Judge Evelyn Reed sat calmly while Bailiff Henderson fumbled with the handcuff keys, his large hands shaking so badly he could barely fit the key in the lock. "Judge Reed," he whispered, his voice thick with horror and shame. "Jesus Christ, Judge Reed, I am so sorry. I didn't recognize you in your civilian clothes, and when they brought you in like that, It's all right, Henderson," Evelyn replied softly, rubbing her bruised wrists as the cuffs fell away. "You weren't a part of this. But I need you to do something for me now, and I need you to be quick and quiet. Anything, Your Honor, anything at all. I need you to go to my chambers. Quietly. Bring me my judicial robes, the black ones with the gold trim. And Henderson—" She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze steady and intense. "Bring my gavel, too, the engraved one from my swearing-in ceremony." Henderson nodded vigorously and hurried out, a man on the most important mission of his life. Evelyn was left alone with her thoughts. She closed her eyes and took a slow, deep breath, centering herself the way she had learned to do during her 23 years on the bench. This morning, she had been Judge Evelyn Reed, a respected jurist, a protector of the Constitution, a guardian of justice. In the span of 15 minutes, she had been transformed into a victim, a defendant, an anonymous woman in handcuffs facing a litany of trumped-up charges. But now it was time to reclaim what was hers. Her phone, confiscated during the arrest but now returned, buzzed incessantly with missed calls and frantic messages. Her clerk, Janet Morrison, had been in a panic. "Judge Reed, where are you? The Peterson hearing is in 30 minutes. Your Honor, the attorneys are here asking about delays. Judge Reed, please, call me back. There are rumors that something happened outside." Evelyn typed back a quick, precise reply. "Tell the Peterson attorneys we will reschedule. Something more important has come up. Clear my entire afternoon calendar." She then scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for. Chief Judge Margaret Carter, the administrative head of the entire judicial district. "Margaret, it's Evelyn." "Evelyn, thank God! We heard there was some kind of incident." Are you all right? I've been better, Margaret. I need you to do something for me. And I need you to do it without asking any questions. Not right now. Of course, whatever you need. I need you to contact the courthouse security office and tell them to immediately preserve and copy all surveillance footage from this morning between 8:45 and 9:15 a.m. All cameras, all angles, inside and out. And, Margaret, make sure there are multiple, redundant copies stored in different secure locations. I want zero chance of this evidence disappearing. There was a pregnant pause on the other end of the line. Evelyn, what exactly happened this morning? A police officer named Calloway just spent an hour testifying under oath about how he heroically subdued a dangerous criminal who was trespassing on courthouse property. Evelyn's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that Chief Judge Carter had never heard before. And the dangerous criminal was me, Margaret, on my way to work. He didn't just arrest me. He assaulted me on the steps of my own courthouse, called me a filthy animal, and told me I belonged in a cage. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds, thick with shock and fury. Jesus Christ, Evelyn. What do you need? Should I call the FBI, the Attorney General's office? Not yet. Right now, I need those surveillance recordings secured, and I need you to start making some phone calls. I want every single case Officer Calloway has testified in over the past 5 years pulled and flagged for immediate review. Every single one. Consider it done. But Evelyn, you can't handle this case yourself. It's a massive conflict of interest. Oh, I'm not going to be the judge in his criminal trial, Margaret. I'm going to be the complaining witness. But first, a cold smile touched Evelyn's lips. First, I'm going to finish this arraignment. In about 10 minutes, I'm going to walk back into that courtroom wearing my judicial robes. Officer Calloway is going to learn exactly who he assaulted this morning, and more importantly, he's going to learn who has the power to ensure he faces the full and terrible consequences of his actions. Henderson returned, carrying a garment bag and a small, polished wooden box. Your robes, Your Honor, and your gavel. Evelyn stood and unzipped the garment bag, revealing the flowing black judicial robes that had been her armor and her symbol for over 2 decades. As she slipped them on, she felt the transformation begin. The heavy fabric settled on her shoulders like a mantle of authority. Each fold was a reminder of the power she wielded, the sacred oaths she had taken, the justice she was sworn to protect. She opened the wooden box and lifted out her ceremonial gavel, its weight familiar and comforting in her hand. Engraved on its handle were the words, Justitia cicca est, sed omnia videt. Justice is blind, but she sees all. Henderson, she said, adjusting her robes, when we return to that courtroom, I want you to announce me properly. Yes, Your Honor. How would you like to be announced? Judge Evelyn Reed straightened to her full height, every inch the formidable federal judge she had been for the past 23 years. The Honorable Judge Evelyn Reed, presiding. She glanced at herself in the small mirror on the wall. The ugly bruise on her cheek was still starkly visible against her dark skin. But now, it served a different purpose. It wasn't just evidence of Calloway's brutality. It was a symbol of how far the system had fallen, and how completely it was about to be restored. When court resumes, she said, her voice a low, dangerous promise, Officer Calloway will learn what justice really means. All rise. Henderson's voice boomed through the courtroom with a thunderous authority that made every single person snap to attention. But what happened next was a moment that would be seared into their memories for the rest of their lives. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Evelyn Reed presiding. The words hit the courtroom like a shockwave. Officer Calloway, who had been leaning casually against the prosecutor's table, whispering with Jennings, went rigid, his blood turning to ice water in his veins. Judge Peterson, still seated in what he now realized with dawning horror was not his chair, turned as pale as death. The prosecutor's mouth fell open in a silent, horrified gasp. Judge Evelyn Reed entered through the judge's private chamber door. She was wearing her full judicial robes, the gold trim catching the overhead lights like a halo of fire. She moved with the slow, measured, deliberate pace of someone who had walked this path thousands of times before. In her right hand, she carried her ceremonial gavel. The silence in the room was absolute, so profound you could hear the frantic pounding of Calloway's heart. Not a single person dared to breathe. She took her place behind the bench, her bench, and sat down slowly, deliberately. Her eyes, cold and sharp as obsidian shards, swept the courtroom, taking in every shocked face, every dropped jaw, every single person who was finally beginning to understand the biblical magnitude of what had just happened. "Officer Calloway," she said quietly, but her voice, amplified by the courtroom acoustics and her own immense authority, carried to every corner. "You may remain standing." Calloway looked like he was about to vomit. His face had cycled from red to white to a sickly green in the span of 30 seconds. Your Honor," Judge Peterson stammered, scrambling to rise from his chair. I mean to say—" "Judge Peterson," Evelyn interrupted, her tone crisp but not unkind. "Thank you for managing my courtroom during my unexpected and violent delay. You may return to your own docket now. I will handle this matter from here." Peterson practically fled from the courtroom, his robes billowing behind him like he was being chased by the hounds of hell. Evelyn turned her full and undivided attention back to Calloway, who was now visibly shaking, his body consumed by tremors he could not control. "Officer Calloway, approximately 2 hours ago, you stood in this spot and testified under oath in my courtroom. Do you recall your testimony?" I... Calloway couldn't form words. His tongue was a thick, useless piece of meat in his mouth. "Let me refresh your memory," Evelyn continued, her voice dangerously calm. "You stated, and I quote from the court record, these people always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability. Do you remember saying that, officer?" Calloway managed a weak, pathetic nod. "You also stated that I was, quote, another entitled activist looking for a payday, and that you had seen, quote, this playbook before. Is that an accurate recollection of your sworn testimony?" The courtroom was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a freight train. And perhaps most memorably, Evelyn's voice grew colder, harder. "You stated that people like me need to learn that, quote, actions have consequences. Do you recall dispensing that particular piece of wisdom, Officer Calloway?" Calloway's legs were shaking so hard he could barely stand. Evelyn reached under her bench and produced a tablet computer, which was already connected to the courtroom's large display monitors. "Officer Calloway, I'd like to show you some evidence that has just come to my attention during our brief recess." She turned the tablet's screen toward the courtroom, and its image flashed onto the large monitors for everyone to see. It was crystal-clear security camera footage from the courthouse steps, showing the entire morning's incident from 6 different angles, all synced together. "This," she said, her voice surgical, "is footage from courthouse security camera number 7, which has an unobstructed high-definition view of the main entrance. Let's watch together, shall we?" Her finger touched the screen, starting the video. The courtroom watched in stunned, horrified silence as the events unfolded. There was Judge Reed, walking calmly toward the courthouse in her civilian clothes. There was Officer Calloway blocking her path, and then his voice, clear as day, captured by the sensitive microphones embedded in the camera housing, filled the courtroom. Another ghetto rat trying to sneak in. Several people in the gallery gasped audibly. The prosecutor, Diane Jennings, began to slowly back away from the table where Calloway stood, as if his toxicity were radioactive. The video continued, showing Calloway's unprovoked, brutal assault in vivid, sickening detail. The slap that snapped Evelyn's head sideways, the brutal grab to her throat, the slam against the pillar, the handcuffs. But the most damning moment, the one that sealed his fate, was yet to come. His own words, spoken with such venom and pure, distilled hatred, echoed through the silent courtroom. "Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses." Several jurors from other cases who had been waiting in the gallery stood up and walked out in disgust. "Officer Calloway," Evelyn said, pausing the video, "do you see any verbal aggression from the defendant in this footage? Any profanity? Any threats? Any resistance at all prior to your assault?" Calloway remained silent, his career, his life, disintegrating frame by frame before his very eyes. "Now," Evelyn continued, her voice relentless, "let's examine your sworn testimony that your body cam malfunctioned." She swiped to a new video file. "This is backup footage from your own body cam, automatically and wirelessly uploaded to the county's encrypted cloud storage system every 60 seconds, a system you apparently, and conveniently, forgot existed." The new video began playing, Calloway's own point of view, and his voice filled the courtroom again, but this time it was even worse. This was the complete, unedited director's cut of his own damnation. "Look at this uppity bitch thinking she can just walk into my courthouse!" Calloway's voice snarled through the speakers, a recording of his thoughts spoken aloud to his cronies before Evelyn had even reached the steps. "These people need to learn their place. Time to teach another lesson." Prosecutor Diane Jennings was now frantically gathering her papers, trying to physically and metaphorically distance herself from the catastrophe unfolding before her. But Evelyn wasn't finished. She was nowhere near finished. "Officer Miller, Officer Diaz," she called out, her voice cracking like a whip. "You both testified under oath that Officer Calloway handled the situation with remarkable professionalism. Would either of you like to revise your sworn statements at this time?" Both officers were already edging toward the exit, their faces ashen. "And here," Evelyn said, advancing the video to show the assault from Calloway's own body cam perspective, a nauseating first-person view of the attack. "Here we can see the precise moment when Officer Jonathan Calloway committed felony assault against a sitting federal judge." She let those words hang in the air for a long, heavy moment. "Federal judge." Calloway's knees finally buckled. He grabbed onto the prosecutor's table to keep from falling. "But wait," Evelyn said, her voice taking on an almost conversational, yet terrifying tone. "There's more." She pulled up a new file on her tablet. "This is audio from Officer Thompson's body cam, which was apparently functioning perfectly this morning." A new voice filled the courtroom. Thompson's voice, speaking to Rodriguez while Calloway was assaulting Evelyn. "Dude's really going off on this one. You think she's actually somebody important like she keeps trying to say?" Rodriguez's voice responded, followed by snickering. "Nah, man. Look at her. Calloway knows what he's doing. Probably just another welfare queen trying to scam the system." More laughter from the officers as they watched their colleague brutalize a federal judge. The few remaining spectators in the gallery were staring at Calloway with expressions of undisguised revulsion. "Officer Calloway," Evelyn said, setting down her tablet, her gaze pinning him in place. "You questioned whether I had any employment verification. Well, I do." She gestured to the Great Seal of the United States mounted on the wall behind her bench, then to her nameplate, then to the official oil painting of her that hung in the courthouse lobby. "I have been the presiding judge of this courthouse for 23 years, Officer Calloway. Every single case you have ever testified in, every warrant you have ever requested, every search you have ever conducted in this jurisdiction has been under my authority Calloway finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled, pathetic whisper. "Your Honor, I didn't know." "You didn't know?" Evelyn repeated the words slowly, letting their pathetic inadequacy hang in the air. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to look. You saw a black woman, and you made assumptions. You saw someone you thought was powerless, and you decided to abuse your power for your own sick amusement." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes boring into his. "But Officer Calloway, there's something else you didn't know." The courtroom held its breath. "For the past 6 months, I have been conducting a joint investigation with the FBI's Civil Rights Division into patterns of misconduct, racial bias, and excessive force in this police department. Your name, Officer Calloway, was at the very top of our list." Calloway's face went completely, utterly white. It was the face of a man who had just seen his own ghost. "This morning's incident wasn't random, Officer Calloway. You have been under active investigation, and you just provided us, on a silver platter with the most perfect, irrefutable, undeniable evidence we could have ever hoped for." She lifted her gavel, holding it in front of her like a scepter. "Officer Calloway, you said that actions have consequences. You were right about that." The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. "Court will recess while I consider the appropriate charges to be filed against you, Officer Miller and Officer Diaz." Calloway collapsed into a chair, his body finally giving out. His career, his reputation, and his freedom were now hanging by the thinnest of threads, and Judge Evelyn Reed was holding the scissors. When court resumed 20 minutes later, the atmosphere had completely transformed. Word had spread through the courthouse like wildfire. Lawyers, clerks, bailiffs, and court reporters had quietly filed into the gallery, drawn by the whispers of the most spectacular courtroom reversal in the building's history. The room was packed, standing room only. Calloway sat slumped in what was now, unequivocally, the defendant's chair. His uniform was wrinkled, his face ashen. His hastily summoned attorney, a nervous public defender who looked like he was about to be sick, kept shooting worried glances between his client and the judge's bench. Judge Evelyn Reed returned to her bench with the same measured dignity she had displayed thousands of times before, but now every eye in the room saw her differently. This wasn't just any judge. This was the woman who had been brutally assaulted by the man now trembling before her, and she was about to become the instrument of his destruction. "Officer Calloway," she began, her voice carrying the full weight of her 23 years of judicial authority. "Before we proceed with the numerous and serious criminal charges you now face, I believe this court, and everyone present, deserves to understand exactly who you assaulted this morning." She stood, moving from behind the bench to address the packed courtroom directly, as if they were her jury. "My name is Judge Evelyn Reed. I have served as the presiding judge of this United States District Court for 23 years. I was appointed to this position by President Clinton in 2001, and I was confirmed by the United States Senate with a unanimous vote." Her voice grew stronger with each word, each credential a hammer blow against Calloway's crumbling world. "I graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, where I was the first black woman to serve as editor-in-chief of the Harvard Law Review. Before my appointment to the bench, I served for 8 years as a federal prosecutor in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice." Calloway's attorney was frantically scribbling notes, his pen barely able to keep up, likely calculating the astronomical number of years in federal prison his client was now facing. "During my tenure as a federal prosecutor," she continued, her eyes finding Calloway's, "I specialized in cases involving police misconduct, civil rights violations, and institutional racism. I successfully prosecuted 47 cases against law enforcement officers who abused their authority and betrayed their oath." She paused, letting that number sink into the silent room. "In my 23 years on this bench, I have presided over more than 15,000 cases. I have sentenced hundreds of defendants, from petty thieves to murderers. I have seen every type of criminal behavior, every excuse, every pathetic justification imaginable. Judge Reed walked closer to where Calloway sat, cowering. But in all my years of service, Officer Calloway, I have never, not once, encountered such a perfect, pristine, textbook example of everything that is wrong with policing in America. The packed courtroom was silent, save for the sound of Calloway's ragged, labored breathing. You see, Officer Calloway, when you called me a ghetto rat and a filthy animal, when you told me I belonged in a cage, when you slammed my head against the wall of my own courthouse, you weren't just assaulting a random citizen. She returned to her position behind the bench, a figure of immense and terrible power. You were assaulting the one person in this entire state who has dedicated her entire career to ensuring that officers exactly like you are held accountable for their actions. Judge Reed opened a thick file that a clerk had placed on her bench during the recess. It was Calloway's entire service record. This file contains the detailed records of every case you've testified in over the past 5 years. 43 cases, Officer Calloway. 43 times you have stood in my courtroom and sworn to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. She flipped through several pages. 28 of those cases involved defendants who were people of color. In 26 of those cases, you were the sole arresting officer. And in every single one, Officer Calloway, you described the defendants using remarkably similar language to what you used with me this morning. She began to read from his reports. Subject was acting erratically. Refused to comply with lawful commands. Became aggressive. Threatened officer safety. The same words, the same narrative, the same lies, over and over and over again. Judge Reed closed the file with a sharp, final snap. But here's what you didn't know, Officer Calloway. As I mentioned, I've been working with the FBI. The investigation wasn't just into the department. It was into you. Your name, Officer Calloway, appears on a federal watch list for officers with a high incidence of civil rights complaints. You have been under surveillance. Your communications have been monitored. Your arrest patterns have been analyzed by DOJ statisticians. She leaned forward slightly. And this morning, Officer Calloway, you provided us with the most perfect, unambiguous, undeniable evidence of criminal civil rights violations that any prosecutor could ever hope for. Judge Reed lifted her gavel. You assaulted a federal judge while she was performing her official duties. You did so based explicitly on racial animus, as evidenced by your own recorded statements. You then committed perjury when you lied, repeatedly, under oath about the circumstances of that assault. The gavel hovered in the air, a pendulum of doom. Officer Calloway, you told me this morning to know my place. Well, let me tell you exactly what my place is. Her voice filled the courtroom with quiet, righteous authority. My place is on this bench, in this courtroom, ensuring that justice is served. My place is holding people like you accountable when you abuse the sacred power we have entrusted to you. The gavel came down once, a sharp crack of doom. My place, Officer Calloway, is making sure that what you did to me this morning is the last act of racial violence you will ever commit as a police officer. Calloway finally understood. He hadn't just assaulted a random woman. He had assaulted justice itself. And justice was about to hit back with the force of a hurricane. Officer Calloway, Judge Reed began, opening another thick manila folder. Let's examine your distinguished career in law enforcement, shall we? Calloway's attorney leaned over to whisper urgently in his client's ear, but Calloway seemed paralyzed, a statue carved from regret, unable to respond to anything happening in the world around him. According to these records from Internal Affairs, which my office subpoenaed an hour ago, you have been the subject of 47 formal citizen complaints during your 15-year career. 47, Officer Calloway. That averages to more than 3 complaints per year. She pulled out a document and held it up for the court to see. Let's start with complaint number 1, filed in 2009. Mrs. Rosa Delgado, a 63-year-old grandmother, alleged that you called her a beaner bitch during a routine traffic stop for a broken tail light, and slammed her face into the hood of her car when she asked for your badge number. A low murmur of disgust rippled through the packed courtroom. Your department's internal investigation, conducted by your sergeant who was later fired for corruption, concluded that Mrs. Delgado's allegations were unsubstantiated. Interesting, considering we now have high-definition video evidence of you using remarkably similar language and tactics. Judge Reed flipped to another page. Complaint number 12 from 2012. Jamal Washington, a 17-year-old high school honor student, alleged that you planted a baggie of marijuana in his backpack after he refused to provide information about his older brother, who you were harassing. Once again, your department found the complaint unsubstantiated. Mr. Washington lost his college scholarship because of that arrest, Officer Calloway. He now works 2 minimum-wage jobs to support his family. Calloway's breathing was becoming more labored, each revelation another shovel of dirt on his casket. Complaint number 23, from 2016, Dr. Michael Johnson. Yes, Dr. Johnson, a prominent cardiologist, alleged that you arrested him for burglary while he was watering the flowers in his own front yard because you didn't believe a black man could live in that neighborhood. Dr. Johnson spent 6 hours in a holding cell before his attorney could secure his release. She looked directly at Calloway, her eyes filled with contempt. What was the department's finding on that complaint, Officer Calloway? I don't... Calloway's voice was barely audible. Unsubstantiated, Judge Reed answered for him, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Are you beginning to see a pattern here? Chief Judge Margaret Carter had quietly entered the courtroom and was now sitting in the front row, her expression grim as she took meticulous notes. But here's what's really interesting, Officer Calloway. I've had my clerks cross-reference your complaint record with your arrest statistics, and some fascinating patterns emerge. Judge Reed directed the court's attention to the large monitors, where a series of charts and graphs now appeared. Over your 15-year career, you have made 1,252 arrests. Of those arrests, 1,089, that's 87%, involved people of color. In contrast, the demographics of your patrol area are 42% white, 31% Hispanic, and 27% black. She used a laser pointer to highlight the stark disparity. Even more telling, your use of force reports show that you used physical force in 63% of your arrests involving people of color, compared to only 12% of your arrests involving white suspects. Calloway's attorney was no longer writing. He was just staring, likely preparing an insanity defense for himself for ever taking this case. And here's perhaps the most damning statistic of all, Judge Reed continued, her voice cold and methodical. Of your 1,089 arrests of people of color, 432 of those cases were ultimately dismissed by the DA's office due to lack of evidence, prosecutorial misconduct on your part, or clear violations of constitutional rights. That's a dismissal rate of nearly 40%. She turned her gaze back to Calloway. Officer Calloway, do you know what we call it in the legal profession when a police officer has a 40% dismissal rate due to constitutional violations? We call it a pattern of criminal behavior masquerading as law enforcement. The courtroom was deadly silent, the only sound the frantic scratching of reporters' pens on paper. But wait, Judge Reed said, her tone almost conversational now. There's more. I've also reviewed the financial impact of your career on the taxpayers of this county. She displayed another document on the screens. Over the past 15 years, this county has paid out $2.3 million in settlements and judgments directly related to your conduct. $2.3 million, Officer Calloway. That's more than the entire annual budget for some of our city's public schools. Calloway finally found his voice, a pathetic, croaking plea. "Your Honor, I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Judge Reed interrupted, her voice rising in controlled fury. "Officer Calloway, let me read you the oath you took when you became a police officer." She pulled out an official document and read aloud, her voice ringing with the sanctity of the words he had defiled. "I, Jonathan Calloway, do solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the state constitution, to bear true faith and allegiance to the same, and to faithfully and impartially discharge the duties of my office according to the best of my ability, so help me God." She set the document down. "Faithfully and impartially, Officer Calloway, not selectively, not based on skin color, not based on your own vile personal prejudices." Judge Reed walked around the bench again, addressing the entire courtroom. "What we are witnessing here isn't just the behavior of one rogue officer. This is the inevitable, rotten fruit of a system that protects officers like Calloway, that dismisses complaint after complaint, that pays settlement after settlement, all while allowing the abuse to continue, unchecked and unseen." She turned back to Calloway. "But that system failed you today, didn't it, Officer Calloway? Because today, you finally chose to assault someone who had the power to pull back the curtain and expose everything." Calloway's head dropped into his hands, his body finally surrendering to the weight of his crimes. "Officer Calloway, you spent this morning telling this court that people like me need to learn our place. Well, I think it's time you finally learned yours." Judge Reed returned to her bench and lifted her gavel. "Your place, Officer Calloway, is in a defendant's chair, facing the full and merciless consequences of 15 years of criminal behavior." The gavel came down with a thunderous finality. "And that is exactly where you are going to stay." Judge Reed stood behind her bench, her judicial robes flowing around her like armor forged from justice itself. The packed courtroom held its collective breath as she prepared to deliver what everyone knew would be a historic sentence. "Officer Jonathan Calloway," she began, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of jurisprudence. "Before I render judgment in this matter, I want to address not just you, but everyone in this courtroom and everyone who will hear about what happened here today." She gestured to the gallery, packed with lawyers, court staff, reporters, and citizens drawn by the extraordinary proceedings. This morning began with a simple question. What happens when someone with a badge and a gun believes they are above the law? What happens when years of unchecked power and systemic protection create a person who thinks they can assault a federal judge on the steps of her own courthouse and face no consequences? Calloway sat slumped in his chair, a broken man, his life crumbling around him in real time. "The answer, Officer Calloway, is standing before you right now." Judge Reed picked up her gavel, the one engraved with the words, "Justice is blind, but she sees all. For 15 years you have terrorized this community. For 15 years you have violated the constitutional rights of citizens whose only crime was existing while black or brown. For 15 years you have made a mockery of the badge you were sworn to honor." Her voice grew stronger, more passionate, a vessel for the voiceless. "But your greatest mistake, Officer Calloway, wasn't any single act of brutality. Your greatest mistake was believing that the system would always protect you, no matter how far you went, no matter how many lives you destroyed." Calloway finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and utterly defeated. "This morning, when you called me a filthy animal and told me I belonged in a cage, when you slammed me against the wall of my own courthouse, when you handcuffed me and paraded me through these halls like a criminal, you thought you were asserting your dominance over just another powerless victim." Judge Reed leaned forward, her voice dropping to a powerful whisper, forcing everyone in the packed courtroom to strain to hear her words. "But I was never powerless, Officer Calloway. and neither were any of the people you brutalized over the years. The only difference is that today, justice finally had a witness with a gavel. She straightened to her full, imposing height. Officer Calloway, based on the irrefutable evidence presented in this courtroom, evidence that came from your own mouth, your own actions, your own camera, I find you guilty of assault in the first degree, a felony. The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. I find you guilty of assault on a judicial officer, a federal felony carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in prison. Calloway's attorney closed his eyes and put his head in his hands. I find you guilty of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a federal felony punishable by up to 10 years in prison. With each pronouncement, Calloway seemed to shrink further into his chair. And I find you guilty of perjury in the first degree for your false testimony given under oath in this very courtroom. Judge Reed paused, letting the immense weight of those charges settle over the room. But Officer Calloway, this case was never really about you. You are simply a symptom of a much larger disease that has infected our justice system for far too long. She turned to address the packed gallery. For too long, we have allowed police officers to operate with impunity. For too long, we have dismissed complaints, ignored evidence, and paid settlements while allowing the abuse to continue. For too long, we have told victims of police brutality that their experiences don't matter, that their word doesn't count, that justice isn't for them. Her voice rose with the passion of a warrior. But that ends today, in this courtroom. What happened here today proves that no one is above the law. Not police officers, not prosecutors, not judges, not politicians. No one. Calloway suddenly broke down completely, his body racked with sobs that echoed through the silent courtroom. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words choked with self-pity. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I never meant—" Judge Reed looked down at him, not with pity, but with a cold, righteous clarity. "Officer Calloway, your apology is 15 years and 47 complaints too late. Your remorse is only appearing now because you finally got caught by someone with the power to hold you accountable." She lifted her gavel high above her head. "But here's what I want you to understand in your final moments as a free man. Every person you brutalized over the years deserved the same justice I am delivering today. Every grandmother you called a slur, every teenager you planted drugs on, every doctor you arrested for living in the wrong neighborhood. They all deserve to see you held accountable. Ontons." The gavel hovered in the air. "Today, I am not just delivering justice for myself. I am delivering justice for every single person whose complaints were dismissed as unsubstantiated. I am delivering justice for every family who had to watch their loved one get brutalized while the system looked the other way." Her voice filled every corner of the courtroom. "Officer Calloway, you told me this morning to know my place. Well, let me tell you what my place is. My place is ensuring that bullies like you can never again hide behind a badge while destroying innocent lives." The gavel came down with a sound like the crack of thunder. "Officer Jonathan Calloway, you are hereby sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed by law. You will serve 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." Calloway collapsed completely, his sobs now the uncontrollable wails of a damned soul. "Furthermore," Judge Reed continued, her voice cutting through his cries, "I am ordering a full, independent federal investigation into every case you have touched, every arrest you have made, and every complaint that has been filed against you. The victims you have silenced for 15 years will finally have their day in court." She set down her gavel and looked out over the packed courtroom. "Let this be a message to every police officer, every prosecutor, every official who thinks they can abuse their power without consequence. Justice may be blind, but she sees everything, and eventually, she comes for everyone." The courtroom erupted in spontaneous, thunderous applause that lasted for 5 full minutes. Justice had finally been served. 6 months later, the ripple effects of that historic morning continued to transform the entire justice system. Officer Calloway was serving his 25-year sentence in a maximum security federal prison, where his fellow inmates, having learned about his crimes through the extensive news coverage, made his life a living hell. His badge, his pension, his freedom. All gone. The man who once terrorized an entire community now spent his days in protective custody, finally understanding what it truly felt like to be powerless. But Calloway's downfall was just the beginning. The federal investigation Judge Reed ordered uncovered a web of corruption that reached deep into the police department's command structure. 12 officers were terminated. 4 supervisors were criminally charged with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The entire department was placed under a federal consent decree forcing radical top-to-bottom reform. Chief Judge Margaret Carter established new protocols, dubbed the Reed Mandates, requiring automatic federal review of any case involving allegations of police misconduct against judicial personnel. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers, with tamper-proof, cloud-based backup systems that could never be malfunctioned away. Most importantly, the 432 cases Calloway had tainted were reopened. Dozens of wrongfully convicted defendants were exonerated and released from prison. Hundreds more had their charges dropped or their sentences reduced. The county paid out an additional $8.7 million in compensation to Calloway's victims, money that came directly from the police department's bloated budget. Judge Reed herself became a national symbol of judicial integrity and courage. She was invited to speak at law schools across the country, sharing the story of how one moment of violence revealed decades of systemic abuse. Her message was always the same. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice delivered is justice for all. The courthouse where it all happened was formally renamed the Judge Evelyn Reed Federal Courthouse in her honor. A bronze plaque near the entrance now commemorates the morning that changed everything with a simple inscription: "Here, justice finally found its voice." But perhaps the most powerful change was in the community itself. Citizens who had spent years terrified to report police misconduct began coming forward, knowing their complaints would finally be heard. Community oversight boards were established with real power. Police training programs were completely overhauled, with Judge Reed personally designing the new curricula on constitutional rights and de-escalation. The young law clerk who had witnessed the proceedings that day, inspired by Judge Reed's courage, decided to specialize in civil rights law. She now works for the ACLU, fighting similar battles in courtrooms across the nation. Rodriguez and Thompson, the officers who had supported Calloway's lies, were terminated and faced federal charges. Their recorded laughter while watching a federal judge being brutalized became evidence in a case study taught at police academies, nationwide as a stark example of institutional corruption. The video of Judge Reed delivering her verdict became the most watched courtroom footage in Internet history, viewed more than 50 million times. Comments poured in from around the world, from people who had experienced similar injustices but had never seen accountability delivered so completely, so publicly, so perfectly. Today, Jonathan Calloway sits in his prison cell, probably thinking about the moment he chose to assault a woman because he thought she was powerless. He thought he knew his place in the world. He thought he knew hers. He was wrong about both, because sometimes justice doesn't just wear a blindfold. Sometimes justice wears judicial robes. Sometimes justice carries a gavel. And sometimes, when the moment is right, justice hits back. Never underestimate the power of standing up to bullies. Share this story if you believe that everyone deserves justice, regardless of who they are or what they look like. Hit that like button if you want to see more stories of courage triumphing over corruption, and subscribe. Because just stories like this happen every day, and everyone deserves to see them. Your story could be next. Truth always finds a way.